Welcome to this module on Diagnostic and Mastery Assessment in Reading. I'm Erica Lemke from the University of Missouri. If you have watched the module on Progress Monitoring in Reading, you might have seen me there. Happy to be with you and talk a little bit more about this Diagnostic and Mastery Assessment. So here are some of the ideas that we're going to go through in this module. First, we're going to talk a little bit about diagnostic assessment in general. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about CBMS, or curriculum-based measurements, with error analysis. Then we're going to talk about CBA, or curriculum-based assessment. Finally, toward the end, we're going to talk about integrating diagnostic and progress monitoring data, both really powerful tools to inform your instruction, and then sort of taking us to the next steps in this process. So what are your objectives as we move through this content? One, we're going to identify specific skills or strategies in reading that you need to teach. We're going to help you sort of target those specific skills that you might need to be working on as you think about your students' needs. We're going to look at and think about how to use error analysis within CBM to inform our assessment and instruction. How do we really maximize those CBM measures to make sure we can look for patterns of errors that students are making? We're going to talk about how to develop and use CBAs, or curriculum-based assessments, to help refine our instructional focus and to determine if students are learning what we're teaching them. We're also going to learn about how to use diagnostic data with our progress monitoring data to inform the content of instructional adaptations we make. And then we're going to bring everything together at the end. So you might remember or might have seen this before in other modules. This is the framework for data-based instruction. This is from the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And this model really provides that DBI process that we're using as our framework. It starts with that validated intervention program, that Tier 2 or standard protocol that we hope that students are receiving prior to engaging in that data-based instruction. We're using progress monitoring data to determine if students are responsive or not responsive to that validated intervention program that we're providing. And then we're using additional diagnostic data to help us make determinations about changes that may need to be made or adaptations that need to be made if a change is warranted for a particular student. We continue the cycle of progress monitoring, again, assessing response or lack of response to determine if those instructional adaptations are being effective for a particular student. Let's look at what happens when we add specific reading components in with this model and these assessments. So we know that CBMs, we often call those general outcome measures or GOMs. Sometimes we talk about those as measures of overall proficiency or indicators of reading proficiency. Those are long-term outcome measures. We're using CBMs as our progress monitoring tool. The question that this is answering is, how are our students responding to intervention within those big idea areas of reading? What are those big idea areas? Well, the big five. So phonological awareness, fluency, comprehension, those big foundational elements of reading. That diagnostic information might include things like CORE, the Center on Reading Excellence assessment battery. You're going to see some examples later of some of those diagnostic assessments. I'm sure you can think of some diagnostic assessments that you currently utilize, things like quizzes, exit slips, checklists. There might be some type of quick assessment that goes with the content that you're using. All of those give you more information about whether students excuse me, are mastering the content that you just taught, what particular skills they might still be having difficulty with following your teaching, so that you can go back and really target those skills they're missing. So what specific reading skills or strategies do I teach? It's different than this general outcome measure information, because this gives us a sense of how are they responding broadly to those big five. This gives me a sense of what more specific skills or strategies do I need to teach. It's awesome because they work together, but they're giving you different types of information. Finally, we're also looking at even more specific skills, looking at our CBM with their analysis, looking at curriculum-based assessment to help us identify how we can refine our instructional focus and determine if students are really mastering what we've taught them. All of these assessments sort of work together to provide that overview of information that we need to know about how to determine if intervention is working for students, and then how to make revisions or refine that program if it's not working for students. We might have, for example, just a couple of other examples of some of those diagnostic assessments. We might have weekly spelling test that we give students after teaching a group of vocabulary words. It gives you sort of that sense of individual skills and whether students are mastering those skills. So let's talk a little bit about progress monitoring tools. We talked just a minute ago about how we use progress monitoring. Here it's throughout this framework, this DBI framework, to determine if students are responsive or non-responsive. When we talk about progress monitoring tools, we're really talking about general outcome measures such as CBM. We're thinking about how we can monitor overall progress toward meeting grade level expectations. So for instance, a good CBM in that area might be word identification fluency for first grade. It could be that it's a measure that samples the range of skills for a grade, so math concepts and applications for a grade. But all of these measures are tested by researchers. There's lots of information and research that's been conducted on particular CBM measures. We want to make sure that we go to validated sources so that you can be confident about those measures you're using. For mastery measures, we're evaluating, which is another type of progress monitoring tool. We're evaluating progress toward mastery of a specific skill. It's only part of what's expected in that subject. It can be designed by teachers. It might not be validated. It might not have been tested by researchers. It gives teachers some information, but we want to be careful because we might not have the same kind of evidence to support it, and so we want to be cautious as we use that information. So as we think about these types of measures, we might be considering whether these measures are CBMs or whether they're mastery measures. They're both different types of progress measures, but where do they fit? So first, we think about a phoneme segmentation fluency task. It's a broad overview of different words, and the teacher says the word and then the students have to say the sounds. It's not centered on particular sounds. It's just broadly sounds that students might encounter. So what do you think, CBM or a mastery measure? Okay, so think about that one, phoneme segmentation. Then oral reading fluency. Okay, overall, how are students doing in reading words correctly in 1 minute? Provides a sort of a general outcome measure of how students are performing in reading. And finally, knowledge of particular letter sounds. So as they go down through a particular list of words. We might highlight particular letter sounds and have them read words with those sounds. So think about each one of these. Think about this. Here we are. We've got the first two that are CBMs, phoneme segmentation and oral reading fluency. They provide a broader overview of skills that a student might encounter throughout a long period of time. They don't target specific skills. This final one targets particular letter sounds, so that would be more of a mastery task. I've mastered certain letter sounds, now I'm ready to go on to the next set of letter sounds. That's how those measures really differ. So let's look at how these different types of assessments fit with our framework from the National Center on Intensive Intervention. So here, we looked at this before, but we have these CBM, general outcome measures. Those are used for that progress monitoring piece. We have different types of diagnostic assessments. We have both assessments like a phonics survey from the core assessment book. We have CBM with their analysis, plus CBA gives us a sense of focal point for our instruction next. That diagnostic assessment, those mastery measures, tell us what the students do and do not know and how to use that information to decide what to teach. Specific skill assessment tells us whether or not the student has learned the skills you've taught or are teaching, and you use that information to determine if your method of instruction is effective. So in essence, that diagnostic assessment informs the content, while specific skill informs your actual teaching practices or your pedagogy. And all three of those different types of assessments really fit together in creating this nice picture of student progress overall. Okay, so just a little bit more about each of those types of assessments. So let's think about how these CBMs and mastery assessments fit together. It's nice actually to look at some examples and think about the purposes of those assessments. So here we have some examples of both CBMs. We've got some examples over here of mastery measures. And then these are some of the features of those measures. So let's look first at CBMs. We saw earlier an example of a phoneme segmentation fluency measure, nonsense word fluency, oral reading fluency, all general outcome measures, sort of overall sense of proficiency. These are overall how are students doing in early literacy skills, overall how are students doing in reading, okay? Then on the mastery measure side, we have things like diagnostic skills, really targets skills that we are wanting, that we've taught to really identify or narrow in on what needs to be retaught. We have CBMs that we can use error analysis with to identify particular skills deficits. And we have curriculum-based assessment, which really gives us a focal point for methods we need to use of teaching. What are the different features of each of these types of assessment? CBM, you keep hearing me say it, they're global indicators. They really have strong technical adequacy. We haven't talked a lot yet about technical adequacy, but that really means reliability, validity. It has strong technical features. Where can you find out more about those technical features? On the tools chart on the National Center for Intensive Intervention, they have experts scrutinize these measures, and they give you a sense of some of those technical features, so you don't have to figure it out yourself. These measures are efficient to administer because they are short duration. Many are between 1 and 3 minutes. They're meant to be efficient to administer. Mastery measures, what are some of the features of those? They indicate mastery of a particular concept. They're representative of specific skills. So they don't have that sort of broad base long-term outcome. They're really skill specific. And we're really drilling down to try to find specific skills that a student might be struggling with. So you might remember Zane if you've watched the progress monitoring module. We were first introduced to Zane in that module. He's a 3rd grade student receiving special education services for a learning disability in reading, and he receives small group instruction 3 times a week from his teacher, Miss Smith. Some of his strengths that Miss Smith has identified is that he's motivated to read, especially about animals. He particularly likes texts about dinosaurs. He's memorized a lot of those sort of difficult dinosaur names. I'm not sure that he would be able to decode those because he does have difficulty with multisyllabic words, but he definitely is motivated to read about animals and particularly dinosaurs. He might be sort of familiar to many teachers in sort of his strengths and weaknesses. He's receptive to corrective feedback. His weaknesses are in fluency, he guesses at words, and then those difficult multisyllabic words with affixes. So Miss Smith, his teacher, really wanted to know what to target first. So she had to use those diagnostic assessments that we just talked about a bit ago to really drill down and try to identify where to start first with Zane. So she was using explicit phonics instruction, phonemic awareness, and word attack, but she really needed to also practice passage reading and fluency, and oral reading, partner reading, because Zane is, as he's getting older, he needs to move on and be a more fluent reader. And so she actually gave him this core phonics survey, and in a little bit we're going to look at an example of one of those. But it really breaks down some of those basic phonetic skills, and she identified that he was having difficulty with CVC and CVCE, those silent E words, and that he also hadn't mastered some of those basic consonant blends. In addition, we knew, as from before, that he was struggling with some words that have affixes, and so it was important for Miss Smith to use that information to sequence the order in which she introduced materials to Zane. She, as I mentioned, used that core phonics survey, and as she started to implement instruction based on some of that diagnostic information, she also was implementing some progress monitoring and reading. In this case, she was implementing oral reading fluency with Zane once per week. She was graphing the number the number of words he read correctly each week, and she was implementing that intervention that was just described on the previous slide. As she looked at the data after 8 weeks, that's our typical, this is 7 weeks of instruction, and we have 7 data points here. She was pretty clear that she needed to make a change in instruction. We typically want to go even as long as 8 weeks before we make that change, but with only 1 point above the goal line, she was pretty clear that it was time to make a change. She decided that Zane just really needed some additional practice. She actually increased his intervention time by 15 minutes per week. She added 5 minutes of additional intervention time each session to try to get his data back up where it should be, hoping that this additional intervention time would help him be more successful. So she indicated this change with an intervention line and then continued to collect data. Unfortunately, even with that additional time, you can see here that Zane, his trend line compared to the goal line, he's still not responding, unfortunately, to her instructional change. He's increasing, but he's not on track to meet his goal at this time. So she needs to decide what to do next. She uses information from her mastery assessments, from her oral reading fluency, from her diagnostic to decide on the changes she's made. She has been using these mastery assessments, and she's actually been noting the different word types he's been taught in these word lists. She decides that based on the errors on his oral reading fluency, she maybe needs to go back and look at the different word types in those errors he's making in these different word types, and reteach some of those word types to distribute more reading practice across the day to help with maintenance of these word types. So she uses information from his oral reading fluency, from his errors that he's been making on his mastery assessments to really come to the decision that she needs to have more distributed practice across the day on these word types. Again, she goes back to that phonics survey to look at his first attempt compared to this attempt, and he is struggling with maintenance of those word types. So that sort of validates the decision she's made. So let's talk a little bit with someone next to you in your small group, and I want you to jot down what forms of assessment do you use. You've heard me talk about some forms of assessment. You've heard about some of the assessments that Ms. Smith is using with Zane. What forms of assessment do you use? Of the assessments you currently use, what type are they? Are they CBM? Are they mastery? And how do the different types of assessment you use influence your instruction? These are really important questions, so go ahead and take some time to talk about this. If you haven't used these assessments, or if you're not currently using all of these assessments, think about when you've observed in a classroom or in your field experience, what types of assessments you've seen or how assessments have been used to influence instruction in a classroom where you visited. And go ahead and write these answers in your workbook.